Welcome students to lecture 2 of MHHS 1. Last time, in our first lecture, I previewed some of the big questions of this course. I gave you the broad strokes of the who, the what, where, when, why, and how of MHHS, and introduced these questions with the example of Emily Rapp essay Proof of Loss. Today, we'll develop a skill that's crucial in the humanities, and that skill is called close reading. The closeness of that phrase is meant to distinguish that kind of reading from our usual practices of content consumption. We, and I mean me as well here, frequently operate with a TLDR mindset. Too long, didn't read. It's something we'll often say about a news article that pops up in our feed. The headline will tell us everything we need to know as efficiently as possible. No need to read the article itself. When a piece of writing starts using confusing language or gets in too much detail, we'll roll our eyes and skip ahead to get to the point. We'll accuse such a piece of writing of gilding the lily, or just padding out the word count with flowery, useless similes and metaphors. I want to suggest here that this mindset of passive, impatient content consumption is in part a result of that post-clinical, post-Foucauldian culture that we talked about last time. Recall that Foucault said that we now praise the clinic for its empirical efficiency, its modest attention, and its careful objectivity. It ostensibly culls all the information it needs with minimal discourse, with the least amount of chatter possible, TLDR. Today, I'll be modeling some close reading practices with the essay Proof of Loss by showing how Emily Rapp challenges these supposedly efficient ways of knowing and understanding the world. In this lecture, I'll be going through 3 ways of knowing and understanding the world: proof, diagnosis, and fiction. We'll talk about proof first, since we touched on it last time, and it's the type of knowing that gets pride of place in the title of the essay. It's the most authoritative kind of knowing because there's nothing you can say against it. Its deduction is ultimately infallible. So here's an example that you might remember from high school, from maybe high school math classes. We kind of know that the square root of 2 is an irrational number, or a number that can't be written as a reduced fraction with integers on top and bottom. In other words, a ratio. We can be asked to prove that, and after we prove it, there's nothing left to be said. The square root of 2 has to be an irrational number. We proved it. So here's the proof if you don't remember it from your math classes. And I'll go through this very quickly because this is not a math class. So first, you assume that the square root of 2 is actually rational. That means it can be written as a over b, a reduced fraction where a and b are integers. So you square both sides, you get 2 equals a squared over b squared, multiply both sides by b squared, and we get 2b squared equals a squared. So that means a squared is an even number since it's a multiple of 2. If a squared is an even number, that would mean that a is also an even number since an odd number squared would still be an odd number. So that means we can write a as 2k, meaning it's a multiple of 2. So we get 2b squared equals 4k squared, which reduces to b squared equals 2k squared. So by the same logic as before, that means b is also even. But if a and b are both even, then a over b is not a reduced fraction since they are both multiples of 2, right? So this means that we've arrived at a contradiction, and that means our initial assumption that the square root of 2 being rational has to be wrong. Therefore, the square root of 2 is irrational. All right, so I went through that very quickly, but again, this is not a math class. So this type of proof is known as a reductio ad absurdum, Latin for reducing the argument down to an absurdity. We argued for the opposite of what we were trying to prove and proceeded to an absurd contradiction at the end. Notice that there is no extraneous step in the proof. It is as efficient and modest as possible. There's no digression at all about why it matters that the square root of 2 is rational or irrational. We don't care about the nature of rational numbers or irrational numbers in this proof. There is nothing that you could say at any step to challenge the logical deductions that lead to the triumphant contradiction at the end that proves our initial proposition. So this is why I think it's so important that Rapp essay takes this idea of proof as its title. Even though proof seems to foreclose the possibility of discourse, think about Foucault, the essay continues beyond the reductio ad absurdum to find new contradictions, new complications, and new contestations. So I want you to pay attention to how different the conclusion of the essay sounds from the conclusion of the mathematical proof about the square root of 2. So here's the concluding paragraph of the essay. Quote, "This fall, 7 months after Ronan died, I saw my favorite teacher from graduate school in San Diego. As we stood up to leave the beachside cafe where we had met for coffee, he said, 'God has a lot to answer for. We, the living ones, have much to answer for as well. We have to answer for our happiness, our days, the shining moments we know and don't know. This is the true proof of loss, that we continue on, breathing and loving and trying to be happy. When we still have a choice and a chance to strive for what remains today unfinished.'" So as I mentioned in the last lecture, the meaning of the word proof is a shifting target throughout the essay until this, quote, "true proof of loss" in this final paragraph. Rapp seems to arrive at truth, but it sounds much different from the truth of the irrationality of the square root of 2. Whereas the reductio leaves us with closure and the comfort of certainty, the essay leaves us with an unsettlingly open truth. Quote, "We continue on, breathing and loving and trying to be happy." Whereas there's no choice about the square root of 2, we are left here with a, quote, "choice and a chance to strive for what remains today unfinished." Even when the essay arrives at an ostensibly true proof of loss, the titular word proof is still simmering with irony, with incompletion, and with process. Mathematical proof, then, is too rigid, too closed, too modest to capture fully the complexities and inconsistencies of health and disease. This is why the essay's title, Proof of Loss, is consistently ironic. Proof is never the end of the story, but the way that Foucault described the clinical gaze is not so much about the authoritative ironclad logic of the proof, but the shakier constructed authority of the diagnosis. Recall that Foucault spoke of an observing gaze that empirically, modestly, and carefully read off symptoms from the sick body and acted as if diagnosis were proof. That clinical gaze saw symptoms and read off a diagnosis while reorganizing the system of interpretation so that any other competing readings would be perceived as superfluous. Here, uncertain diagnosis is often taken as certain proof. So in the essay, we hear the word diagnosis several times being used in this quasi-Foucauldian way. Quote, "When he was 9 months old, Ronan was diagnosed with Tay-Sachs disease, a rare genetic neurological condition with no treatment and no cure." So the diagnosis has a name, Tay-Sachs. It has a mechanism, genetic neurological condition, and it has a conclusion, no treatment and no cure. A beginning, a middle, and an end. Later, we learn that, quote, "the gene must be carried by both parents." So even with genetic testing, there is still a, quote, "freak genetic chance of passing on this genetic condition." So just as the proof convinced us beyond any reasonable or unreasonable doubt that the square root of 2 is irrational, the diagnosis is meant to convince us that Tay-Sachs disease has a categorizable beginning, predictable middle, and fatal end. But recall that the essay never settles on a clear, unambiguous use of the word proof, and the word diagnosis is no different. Later in the essay, Rapp acknowledges, quote, "Although his father," and I didn't know it at the time, that day of Ronan's diagnosis, driving home from Albuquerque in January 2011, the light strong and cold and winter bright, was the end of our marriage. Diagnosis produces unruly and sprawling discourse that spills out of the hermetic closure of the clinic. There's nothing clear or predictable about it. It ends marriages, begins new relationships, and changes how you live in the world. The essay's irony chips away at the unquestioned authority of proof by modulating into the more uncertain discourse of diagnosis. After all, diagnoses can be and often are wrong. One need only think about the recent phenomenon of long COVID. For a while, diagnosticians rejected the very existence of long COVID because it presented a slate of symptoms that were unpredictable, chronic, and not easily verifiable. Frequently, those with long COVID were told that it was just in their heads and that they'd get better soon. Now, the CDC has finally acknowledged the existence of long COVID and recommends an ongoing dialogue between clinicians and patients about this long, unstable history of health and COVID. Diagnosis, then, has to be less authoritative than proof, just by definition. But as Foucault argues, diagnosis is sneakier. Diagnosis acts like disguises itself as unerring proof, closing off discourse and putting on the veil of impenetrable authority. So the last time we actually hear this word diagnosis in the essay, Rapp uses the words veiled authority to attempt a kind of generalization or universal lesson from the diagnosis. She notes that, quote, there are babies still being diagnosed with Tay-Sachs, and seems to be about to offer a generalizable lesson from her particular experience with the diagnosed disease. Here is my first-person experience, she seems to be saying, and here's how this is a useful manual for your encounter with the disease. But that universal lesson doesn't materialize. Like with long COVID, ongoing discourse is necessary. Even with the supposed authority and conclusiveness of the diagnosis, she laments that Tay-Sachs is, quote, a disease that is still treated like a kind of dark mystery. Clinical diagnosis, praised as Foucault observes for its authority and efficiency, leaves us not with the comforting knowledge or universalizable lessons, but frequently only with Rapp's dark mystery of disease. So, why do we continue to offer that praise for the diagnostic gaze of the clinic? As Rapp shows us, we yearn for the mathematical infallibility of the proof. We will settle for the misleading promise of the diagnosis, but eventually we will have to merely dwell in the dark mystery and learn to be okay with that. From the title Proof of Loss, we've already moved from the mathematical certainty of proof to the disingenuous but well-meaning authority of the clinical diagnosis. What seems to offer the most solace and the most robust answer, as it turns out, is neither the infallibility of proof nor the gentle lie of the diagnosis, but the distortions, dilations, and disruptions of fiction. We learn in the author bio that Rapp is indeed a novelist, so it shouldn't be that surprising that she finds more concrete understanding in fiction than in a proposition about the square root of 2 or the mapped out progression of Tay-Sachs disease. For me as well, as a literature professor, my inclination is to the more honest lies of fiction. In fiction, we can freely acknowledge our imaginative and sometimes unruly constructions of health and disease without demanding either proof or diagnosis. Rapp doesn't understand Tay-Sachs from the diagnosis, but from a simile borrowed from a novel. Quote, when I understood that Ronan's brain would gradually shut down and that he would die, and horribly, like some tragic character in an unbearably sad novel, I didn't actually understand a thing. There are two forms of understanding here that seem to be at odds. In the first clause of the sentence, she seems to understand the diagnosis. Quote, Ronan's brain would gradually shut down and, quote, he would die. In the second clause of the sentence, she backtracks and claims that she, quote, didn't actually understand a thing. So what happened in between? The intervening simile about novelistic fiction, about an unbearably sad novel in which the protagonist dies a slow, agonizing, and heart-wrenching death, seems to modulate understanding in just one sentence. It displaces the supposedly comforting certainty of the diagnosis to the seemingly out-of-place realm of sad novels. It destabilizes understanding to the point that diagnosis ceases to have any recognizable meaning. She continues in the essay to think through these destabilizing and displacing moments through fiction. Quote, I imagine myself as a character in a Dickens novel, the ghost of my own past, wonderfully plagued by impossible circumstance, visited often by the dead. I wanted to see Ronan with my eyes open, to hold him with the same hands that put food in my mouth every day. Here, she's putting herself into Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, in which the miserly Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by three ghosts to teach him the generous spirit of the holiday. She's both ghost and Scrooge at the same time, haunting herself with past versions of her life. Her courtship with Ronan's father was mediated through epistolary fiction. Quote, I had a warm-up marriage to someone I fell in love with over written letters, which at the time I thought was romantic. Again, she is imagining her life through a kind of fiction, time warping to maybe the 18th century when letter writing was the most passionate and intense way to connect romantically. And when she falls out of love with Ronan's father, she reflects on loss and the distorting passage of time with another novelistic simile about how time fast forwards, quote, in a Virginia Woolf novel. Now, I'm not 100% sure about this, but this may refer to the section in Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse called Time Passes, in which we experience the long passage of time from the perspective of a decaying house. So, these fictive distortions, the sad novel, A Christmas Carol, 18th century epistolary fiction, To the Lighthouse, all of these things provide more robust comfort than the misleading and ununderstandable authority of diagnosis or the cold infallibility of proof.